Foreign Secretary of the Maldives, Ambassador to the United States, Ambassador to Canada, Permanent Representative to United Nations through 2017 through 2019, and Secretary Multilateral. The ambassador holds a PhD in international relations from the Australia National University, MA from Leicester University, UK, and a graduate diploma in business administration from University of Sydney, Australia. Now let's welcome our keynote speaker, Ambassador Ali Nasir Muhammad. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jasmine, for that very generous introduction. Thank you, Professor Lewis, and thank you, the panel members, and thank you very much, students. Can you hear me? Okay. I'd like to thank the Law School and the Climate School, as well as Worldview Global Impact for organizing tonight's event on a subject matter that is very close to the citizens of small island developing states like the Maldives. Do I need to give you any introduction about the Maldives? The Maldives is, right, I can see a few shaking their heads or nodding. So the Maldives is one of the lowest lying island nations or archipelagic nations in the world. The country lies right at the very center of the Indian Ocean. I think that photo, the island, may have come from the Maldives, that photo. We are on average barely 3 feet above sea level. So if there is any wave that is higher than 3 feet, would actually pass through the islands from one side to the other. The Maldives has 1,200 islands, out of which 187 islands where permanent population live. We call inhabited islands. And we also have about 150 resorts. Resorts means hotels. In each island is one resort. So there are no 2 resorts in one island. We call one island, one resort. So Maldives is well known for being a luxury tourist destination. So that's a brief introduction about the Maldives. The Maldives has been quite active on the question of climate change, especially on sea level rise, for a long time. Our story of survival in the face of rising sea levels actually began in 1989, when the Maldives had the honor of hosting the first ever intergovernmental meeting of small states to discuss sea level rise. The threat that was clean even then, and the Malé Declaration on Global Warming and Sea Level Rise became a clarion call for global action. We recognized sea level rise as a global challenge needing a collective response. That was in 1989. That moment helped shape diplomatic initiatives of small states, paving the way for the creation of Alliance of Small Island States. When I was ambassador earlier, from 2017 to 2019, I had the honor of chairing the Alliance of Small Island States, which we call AOSIS. AOSIS comprises 37 countries, all of which are small island states. And these 37 countries form a group in negotiations on climate change and sustainable development issues. The Malé Conference of 1989 helped generate formal recognition of small island developing states within the UN system as a critical actor in climate dialogue. The world has seen the dangers we face, and we have not been silent about it. We brought global attention to our struggles from our first meeting in Mali in 1989 to the well-known underwater cabinet meeting the Maldives president had in 2009. The rise in seas pose legal existential questions. What happens, for example, when territories disappear? What of sovereignty when land is lost? What would happen to the cultures, traditions, and the collective and the proud histories of the peoples who existed in those lands for several millennia? These are complex legal questions, and the case is now at the International Court of Justice to address precisely some of these issues. I will therefore not go into these detailed questions. Perhaps our law professor will. And instead, I will focus on the practical steps that SIDS and the international community, especially the emitting countries, could take to ensure that SIDS are in fact protected from sea level rise. I speak for Maldives and for Maldivians. I can tell you, Maldivians are going nowhere from sea level rise. We are committed to facing these challenges, and as the Beatles says in their song, with a little help from my friends. The president of Maldives was here in New York about 10 days ago and gave a speech at the high-level meeting on sea level rise held on 25th September. And in that speech, the president highlighted 3 ways in which international community can help the Maldives and other small island developing states. I will summarize a few of those points. And the first way in which international community can support SIDS is finance, providing access to finance. And that's why the Maldives has been making urgent calls to increase adaptation finance. There are 2 main ways in which finance are dispersed. One is mitigation and the other is adaptation. In the case of sea level rise, the Maldives and other small island developing states have been calling for increase in adaptation finance. Climate adaptation finance has lagged dangerously behind the scale of the crisis. The imbalance between what is needed and what is provided is actually stark. According to UN Environmental Programme's Adaptation Gap Report, which was released in 2023, multilateral and bilateral finance for adaptation dropped by 15% to $21 billion in 2021. Worse still, the adaptation finance gap now sits between $194 to $366 billion. These numbers actually barely scratch the surface of the true needs of SIDS, because the data we have is incomplete. But we know the problem is larger. And we'll be meeting in Baku in November for the COP29 to agree on new climate finance goals. And we must address the unique needs of SIDS in setting those goals. Financial commitments are made and must reflect the urgency and ensure that SIDS get prioritized access to financing and funding as well. The second point that I wish to make is we must operationalize the loss and damage fund. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, would be familiar with the loss and damage fund. We have been negotiating on loss and damage since 2011, and we are happy that the fund has been established now, and our call now is to operationalize that fund immediately. The Antigua-Barbuda agenda for SIDS, which was adopted in May at a summit meeting, at a UN summit meeting held in Antigua. The outcome document of SIDS prioritizes the fund's early operationalization. I had the privilege of co-chairing the negotiations, which started in January and ended in May, that produced that outcome document. The SIDS cannot wait for a lengthy bureaucratic process to protect what is left of their biodiversity, their land, and their economic stability. But even if the fund is operationalized right now, current contributions are insufficient to meet the growing needs. More contributions are critical not only to immediate relief, but also for sustained support to deal with long-term impacts like sea level rise. Even if we hold global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we still face substantial loss and damage. Therefore, financing must be swift, additional resources must be secured, and beyond what is already been pledged and committed. And the third point that I will highlight is that capacity building and technology transfer are essential. And it is important to recognize that the world actually has the technology to build resilience against sea level rise. And the Maldives has actually experienced that. We had a big wave hitting the capital island, Male, in 1987. We didn't know what was going on. We consulted a few scientists in the Maldives as well as from Japan. And within 1 year, we started constructing a seawall around Male, around the capital island. A seawall which is height of 15 feet on average. The seawall has been protecting the island, and we experienced the extent to which such protection can be a barrier against sea level rise during the Indian Ocean tsunami. The Indian Ocean tsunami, we will be marking the 20th anniversary this year on Boxing Day on 26th December. Indian Ocean tsunami actually put the Maldives underwater for the entire country underwater for a few minutes, except the capital Male. So the technology, the science is available, is there, out there. What the small island developing states needs is transfer of that technology with finance to help them to build resilience against sea level rise. And that's why the SIDS for Outcome document, what we call ABAS, calls on the international community to support SIDS by sharing the necessary expertise. These expertise include risk assessments, loss modeling, governance, and resource management. All require advanced technical knowledge. SIDS need the expertise along with systems to monitor and evaluate the impact of loss and damage, and we need them now. Having said that, international support alone is not enough. SIDS need to build their state capacity, and state capacity is crucial. SIDS build their resilience within. State capacity I refer to is the ability to mobilize all available resources, financial, human, technological, and all other resources towards sustainable development and building resilience. Resilience comes not just from what we receive from external sources, but from our belief, from our ability to adapt and thrive. And it also comes down to change in our mindset. SIDS must trust in their capabilities to embrace their goals. External support, access to technology, and talent will help but will not succeed unless it comes from within the country. It is their determination that will see us, and it is their ability to change, to embrace the change, that will make us through the storms and tides of the future. We are not just asking for help, we are standing firm on the face of the threats. The Maldives and all other SIDS are committed to overcome these challenges, and together we will not only survive, but we will thrive, we will adapt, and we will inspire the world. I thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Ali Nasir, for the important information on your country and the global situation of climate change. Our next speaker will be Radley Horton. Radley Horton is a professor at Columbia University Climate School. His research focuses on climate extremes, health risks, and climate impacts and adaptation. Radley was a convening leader author for the third National Climate Assessment, and he is currently the principal investigator for the NOAA Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Funded Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast. He's also the Columbia University lead for the NSF-funded Metropolitan Coastal Transformation Hub, in short, MACH. And the Department of Interior-funded Northeast Climate Science Center readily often appears on national and international television, radio, and in print. He also teaches in Columbia University Sustainable Development Department. Welcome, Professor Radley.
Thank you for the chance to speak to you all today, especially after His Excellency's fantastic and really important remarks. So I am going to spend a little time as a climate scientist unpacking some of the various hazards that the SIDS face. Certainly sea level rise, as we heard, and associated coastal flooding is front and center when we think about this existential threat and the legal dimensions of it, issues of autonomy, human rights, and rights of individuals as well. So we'll start there. I'll unpack some of that science, how in human activities such as the greenhouse gases that have been emitted are increasing those threats. But also, I think we'll have a little bit of time to talk about some additional threats that SIDS face, perhaps not quite as existential, but I think very important in the context of these discussions as we learn more about the threats being posed, for example, by unprecedented heat waves on land, in the ocean, rapidly emerging drought risk and risks associated with loss of access to drinking water, and other hazards that we'll unpack a little bit. Okay, so starting first and foremost with the threat posed by sea level rise. So, here to say that we've had about a foot globally of sea level rise over the last century, which may not sound like very much to folks, but it is profoundly impactful already, and a problem that's just going to grow worse as we make our way out into the future. That sea level rise is primarily, the vast majority of it, is due to human emissions of greenhouse gases. There actually would be a little bit of sea level rise going on anyway without human activities, but a negligible, tiny amount relative to what we're seeing as a result of all the fossil fuel combustion, industrial processes such as cement making, and agricultural practices as well, putting greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. It's important to note that SIDS have been responsible for less than 1%, far less than 1% of those historical greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a key part of this, of these dimensions of these negotiations too, and the sort of ethical dimensions here. So that foot or so of sea level rise that I said is primarily due to human activities can be broken down into a few components. One big part of it is that for a given amount of water sitting in the ocean, because the ocean is warming due to these greenhouse gases, warmer water literally stands taller. So that same amount, that same mass of water is going to stand taller simply as a result. That same volume of water is going to stand taller simply as a result of becoming warmer due to our greenhouse gases. Now, additionally, the ice that sits on land, right, in our mountain glaciers, on the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, more and more of that ice is physically making its way into the ocean. When it melts on land and makes its way into the ocean, that actually adds more mass to the ocean. So in addition to the fact that it's expanding as it warms, there's literally more mass sitting in the ocean as well. And as we've already heard, that can present a number of challenges. There's the issues related to just dealing with the day-to-day effects of the ocean being a little bit higher. That, for example, impacts groundwater. It puts more salt in drinking water supplies in many small island nations. It can also mean that there's a history of, if there's a history of any kind of contaminants, that they can make their way more readily into the water or make their way up into the water table, leading to pollution issues other than just salt intrusion as well. Those are sort of the effects of like this gradual change, this gradual increase in sea level. But probably, you know, more impactful in most cases, of course, SIDS are far from homogeneous, right? There's the variety in all ways is extreme, but a common feature is that, you know, we have these king tides, perhaps a couple times per year, when tidal effects cause sea levels to be higher than they otherwise are. And if you start to put, say, a foot of additional sea level rise over the course of the last century on top of those naturally occurring king tides, you can imagine how that foot can lead to a huge increase in the amount of damages to property, livelihood in various ways. And the frequency with which you'll experience high water levels of a certain threshold increases in what we call a nonlinear way, very frequently, with just a very large increase in frequency with just a small amount of sea level rise. So the way to think about that is essentially that in the past, it took one of these rare king tide natural events that might happen a couple times a year to cause water to reach a certain threshold. If you now impose a certain amount of sea level rise, that means that to reach that high water level that used to only occur rarely, now you need a smaller tidal event, right? Something that might occur very naturally, a couple times a month with the moon cycles, could now be hit at that threshold. And you're starting to experience high water levels that have never been experienced before. So even in, you know, SIDS that don't experience these super impactful tropical cyclones, we can't understate, as we've already heard from His Excellency, just how impactful that average increase in sea level can be, profoundly shifting the frequency of these extreme events. So now, you know, as we look to the future, there is some uncertainty about just how much sea levels are going to rise. It's going to depend to some extent on the greenhouse gases that we emit, for sure, but it also depends on things that are harder to predict and quantify. We don't completely understand how those ice sheets on land are going to respond to the warming that they've already experienced, to changes in ocean circulation that can sort of undercut the dams, if you will, at the edge of those ice where the land meets the water, how changes in air pollution, soot from fires that we're seeing, especially in the northern hemisphere, could change the way that those ice sheets melt. So really what it comes down to is what we call dynamical processes, things that can cause motion, that can get an ice sheet moving, sort of dropping from the high elevation on that ice sheet towards sea level, are very hard to quantify. But what we know for sure is that even under a best case scenario, we're going to see more sea level rise over the next century than we have in the last. And probably a minimum of 2 feet over the course of this century. It's probably roughly a best case scenario. And we can't rule out, unfortunately, the possibility of 4 feet or more globally of sea level rise. So that really profoundly, you know, increases the frequency of coastal flooding. It means that something that maybe used to happen once every 100 years in terms of a high water level could be happening more often than once per year. Just, you know, totally profound shift. So yeah, I wanted to, you know, sort of focus on sea level rise, but I think, you know, it's essential to talk about some related hazards too. As we see this horrific storm Milton bearing down on Florida, of course, all over the world we see huge vulnerability to these types of storms. We have to ask not just about these average increases in sea level, but about storm surge, these situations where winds pile up water at heights beyond even, say, 2, 4, 6 feet, as I've been talking about. Of course, there have always been tropical cyclones, hurricanes. There always are going to be, but some of the things that influence them are pretty clearly linked to our human activities. And the clearest example of that is the temperatures of the upper ocean, right? This is what you're seeing with Milton right now. It's the temperatures at the very surface of the ocean, but also as you go down towards depth. A really powerful hurricane like Milton stirs up the ocean, and it brings up cooler water from below, which of course weakens and sort of kills a hurricane. But as we're seeing these record-breaking ocean temperatures, these marine heat waves you may have heard about all around the world, the surface is warmer. That lets these storms grow more quickly, this explosive growth that nobody can sort of prepare for. It also means that when the winds from these superstorms churn up the ocean, it's harder for them to churn up the cooler waters that will dampen and put a brake on those hurricanes, because this warm water, as the atmosphere warms, is penetrating deeper and deeper. So those are the sort of, that's the sort of airtight link to more extreme storm surges, the warming ocean making these storms more powerful. Additionally, so you combine that sea level rise with a stronger surge, more piling of water, and you see these, increasingly catastrophic impacts. Simultaneously, the warming of the ocean and the warming of the atmosphere with global warming means that even for a given storm that might not be stronger than it would have been in the past, right? It's got the same category level, it's got the same wind strength. You're now going to get more rainfall potential because a warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture. So a storm of the same strength, once things are a degree Celsius or more warmer, could give you 10% more rainfall, right? So now you have higher sea level, stronger storm surge, more rain. So all these things, interact, leading to increasing damage. And the impacts are also highly nonlinear. I said the frequency of flooding changes in a nonlinear way as sea level increases. So do the damages, right? That next foot of water is much more damaging than the last, because it means the water's moving more quickly, waves are penetrating further inland, more loss of life, more damage to critical infrastructure, homes, and livelihood in general. Additionally, talking about the warming of the oceans, it's become clearer and clearer that it's not enough to talk about sea level, even though sea level, as we've heard, poses this existential threat and has to be the first climate hazard that we talk about. But it's also becoming clear that the warming of the oceans are posing all these additional threats, right, to biodiversity, to livelihood with fisheries. We heard about the tourism impacts of coral reefs, for example, but also just the conditions that people are experiencing. As you warm the oceans, air temperatures go up. You also have more humidity, right? We hear it's not just the heat, it's the heat and the humidity. And I think as a climate scientist, one of the things that's being reported as a surprise that shouldn't have surprised us is that a lot of tropical locations, including where some of these SIDS are actually seeing big increases in heat and humidity. It used to be people said, oh, it's always hot and humid, right, in some of these places, which was really a pretty silly thing to say in retrospect. Precisely when it's hot and humid, even a degree increase in temperature, a little more moisture in the air, again, can in a very nonlinear way make it much harder for people with pre-existing health conditions to cool themselves. It can increase the deaths of people with heart disease, respiratory disease, kidney ailments. So these heat stress related hazards deserve attention too, as does the heavy rain that I mentioned in the context of hurricanes. So, of course, it's not enough just to talk about hazards. We're going to have this important discussion around solutions, around what can be done. But as we sort of pivot to that, there are also sort of unique aspects of vulnerability and exposure in some but not all SIDS, right? Just the very fact that some of them, by definition, are smaller in size, can pose additional threats in terms of isolation, in terms of greater reliance on international trade. So we have to think about how some of those things are affected by a changing climate. We have to think about when, even for a natural disaster that might not become more frequent, how is there greater vulnerability? Because you may not have the size to have certain parts of that country be protected should an event come through. You might see impacts everywhere. You might, in some cases, see less diversity in terms of the range of available sources of livelihood. All those sorts of things can mean that for a storm of a given strength, the impacts can be that much worse. And we can't uncouple all of these things from legacies of colonial history as well, issues of resource availability and historic injustices. So just another dimension as we're thinking about some of the ethical and justice components here. So that was sort of, you know, the obligatory, if you will, but I think really important discussion of some of these unique hazards and how quickly they're changing, which really points towards how essential it is that we address adaptation in the ways discussed, sustainable development goals, but also the urgency of profoundly reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, especially those countries and entities that have been responsible for so many of those emissions. So I'm excited to move beyond this part and really get into continuing with hearing about solutions and how we can address in a positive way for all these hazards. Yeah, turn it.
Later, after the next speaker. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Bradley Horton. Thank you for your talk about the global situation of the sea level rising and the solution of it. And speaking of solution, I think impact investing will be one of it. Robin and I were working on the impact investing case study with the CEPA. Our next case will be how to solve the climate change problems with impact investing as one of the tools. Our next speaker will be Michael B. Girard. Michael B. Girard is a professor at Columbia Law School, where he teaches courses on environmental and energy law. And he founded and directs the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. And he formerly chaired the faculty of Columbia Earth Institute and American Bar Association of Environment Section. Before joining the Columbia faculty in 2009, he practiced environmental law in New York City full-time for 30 years. Most recently as partner in large of the New York office of a large law firm. Girard is author or editor of 14 books. Among them are Legal Pathway to Deep Decarbonization in the United States, Global Climate Change and U.S. Law, and Threatened Island Nations, Legal Implication of Risking Sea and a Changing Climate. That's a long name of the book. Welcome, Professor Girard.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Excellency, distinguished guests. In 2010, shortly after I joined the faculty here, I received a call from the permanent representative of the Republic of the Marshall Islands to the United Nations. The Marshall Islands, of course, are in the Pacific. They're not in the Indian Ocean, but they are very similar to the Maldives in that they are also an atoll nation, that they're only about 3 feet above sea level, and they face similar kinds of threats. So the Marshall Islands representative said, some decade, we don't know what decade it is, but some decade we may be underwater. And if we're underwater, are we still a state? Do we still have a seat at the United Nations? What's the citizenship of our displaced people? What rights do we have against those who did this to us? So I did not know the answers to these questions off the top of my head. And we convened what became a major 3-day conference here, bringing people from the Pacific and the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean and so forth, and did a book. And so since then I've done a great deal of work with the Marshall Islands, and what I'd like to talk about this evening is what we've concluded about the issue of statehood and also United Nations membership. So there is no universally accepted definitive definition of what it takes to be a state, but the most commonly used comes from the Montevideo Convention from 1933. And under this convention, there are 4 essential elements to create a state: a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. So I'm going to talk briefly about each of these 4. The permanent population needs to be permanent residents, not just visitors. The expectation is there will be families that make their lives there, and that there would be schools and religious structures and health services and businesses. The smallest permanent population that exists that has been recognized as having these kinds of characteristics is the Pitcairn Islands, which is populated by about 50 people who are descendants of the mutineers of the HMS Bounty and their Tahitian companions from 1790. So it's not a state, but the British overseas, but it's a British overseas territory, but the UN has repeatedly said that it would be entitled to sovereignty if they wanted to go in that direction. So it doesn't have to be a large population, but it has to have families and be self-sustaining. Defined territory. So land protected by seawalls or other kinds of defenses would be eligible. If the land was formerly above water and then it was built up with fill or the like, that would be eligible. Or a platform built on land that was formerly above water. But artificial islands would not count. A platform built on the seabed would not count. A floating island would not count. In terms of the government, there needs to be a government that's able to set rules and enforce rules governing the population. It has to be able to maintain relations with other states. It needs to have offices, but they don't necessarily need to be in the country. Capacity to enter into relations with other states is similar to number 3, but having for instance, a permanent consulate with the UN and ambassadors would satisfy that requirement. Some scholars say that independence is the central criterion for statehood, that it governs itself. It's not within another country. There are also a number of legal principles in international law that suggest that states have a perpetual existence, that they don't cease to exist except through very obviously political factors can cause states to cease to exist, but not physical factors. So there's a presumption of state continuity under international law. There's a general doctrine of the right to self-determination, the idea that countries have permanent sovereignty over natural resources, and the doctrine of the right to state survival. No state has ever been expelled from the United Nations. You know, there have been changes in control. Of course, China was formerly represented by the government of Taiwan, and it was changed to the government of Beijing, but it was the same state. It was just under a different control. The only provision of the UN Charter concerning expulsion of a state is that a member of the UN who has persistently violated the principles contained in the Charter may be expelled by the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council. This has never happened, so we don't have any precedent for it happening. But this is the only provision in the Charter for a state losing its membership in the UN. Now, who would determine that? There's no automatic loss. It would probably require a vote of the General Assembly with a recommendation of the Security Council. But membership in the UN is not identical to recognition by other states. So there are some countries that are not UN members but are recognized by some states. Taiwan, Kosovo, Palestine. And there's some countries that are UN members, but that are not recognized by some states, Israel and North Korea. Now, what happens if a country becomes uninhabitable? What happens if, despite seawalls and other coastal defenses, it's still not possible for anyone to live there, and it loses the characteristics of the Montevideo Convention? It doesn't have a permanent population. It's uninhabitable. So there are several alternatives that can be imagined. If the population moved to a receiving state, and the receiving state basically ceded ownership of the land and delegated administration to the incoming population, there's one precedent for that that I can that I'm aware of. In the 1870s, parts of Iceland became uninhabitable because of volcanic activity that destroyed all the cropland. And a portion of the population of Iceland moved to Canada and was given property in Manitoba. And so for a period of about 20 years, you had this displaced population from Iceland. They were called New Iceland. Over time, they basically became part of Manitoba. But there's still this statue of a Viking that tourists can still visit as a commemoration of this past time. So that's just moving the population. Moving a state itself would involve not only the receiving state giving land, but giving sovereignty over the area to the new state. That has never happened, so far as I know. But one could imagine it, that maybe there's an island that some country would be willing to give up. It would have to be not an atoll island. It would have to be tall enough that it wouldn't also be submerged. But theoretically, that's a possibility. Association with another state. You've had states merge or have other kinds of arrangements. The very large country of Tanganyika and the offshore island of Zanzibar merged in 1964 to form Tanzania. So these two, what had been separate countries, merged to form one country. Obviously, we've had the South Vietnam and North Vietnam became Vietnam, West Germany, and East Germany, but those were obviously under much different kinds of circumstances. Government in exile, that has certainly happened in wartime. The most famous example of that is France under Charles de Gaulle during the Second World War, had a government in exile, but that's intrinsically temporary. There is a discussion of the idea of a deterritorialized state, a state that doesn't have any land. It could have a government, but no territory. The closest examples are the Sovereign Order of Malta and the Holy See, but they're not really very close because they weren't fully states. They had some characteristics of sovereignty, but were not fully states. An ideal solution under this circumstance would be if the General Assembly and the Security Council formally recognize this deterritorialized state as a state. There's some discussion, some literature about the idea of digital sovereignty, that they have websites and so forth. I'm not sure what that really amounts to. In terms of what are the implications of these alternatives, each of these alternatives raises a number of legal issues. So maritime zones are one very important part. A country ordinarily has an exclusive economic zone of 200 nautical miles around its coastline, and that maritime zone can be very important economically in terms of fishing rights and rights to deep sea mining and so forth. And so I've argued that it's a matter of climate justice, that even if a country shrinks or even disappears, it should maintain the rights to the maritime zone as a way of continuing to have some economic viability, some source of income. Citizenship and passports, who can issue passports is obviously a very important question. Mobility and migration, can people move around? Does this entity have a military of some sort? Is it still a UN member? I just talked about that. Can it be a party to the International Court of Justice and other tribunals and international bodies? And the question of who decides, who would decide what attributes some entity has. So there's very recently been some real progress here. A year ago, the United States government made efforts to enhance its partnership with the Pacific Island nations, and the White House issued a statement saying the president announced that the United States considers that sea level rise driven by human-induced climate change should not cause any country to lose its statehood. So this is an official statement from the President of the United States saying that if this terrible event were ever to happen and a country were fully submerged, they would regard it still as a state. A few weeks ago, AOSIS, the organization that the ambassador formerly headed, issued this important declaration on sea level rise and statehood, declaring that the statehood and sovereignty of SIDS and our membership in the United Nations will continue notwithstanding the impacts of climate change related to sea level rise. And the statehood and sovereignty of SIDS will cease only if another form of expression of right to self-determination of a SIDS population is explicitly sought and freely exercised by that population. So this is certainly a recognition by these countries about how they will regard each other. And the fact that the United States has taken a similar position would be very encouraging if this were ever to arise. But it's my own view that this issue should be formally resolved sooner rather than later, because if the time comes when one or more of these island nations are really fully underwater, lots of other places will also be in serious trouble. Bangladesh and just unimaginable suffering around the world, and the plight of the small island states will not be very high on the international agenda. And that's why I think that a formal decision by the Security Council and the General Assembly now setting out this principle in advance would be very beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Michael Girard, on the global situation, on the sea level rising global governance. Now we're open to the Q&A section, and you can ask questions to the specific speaker, or you can ask general question to all the speakers. And you do have a speaker on each seat, right? So yes, just turn on your speaker for your question.
I'll raise my hand for the first question. My question is for Professor Radley, because you mentioned about the Hurricane Milton. So right now, I guess people are really concerned because the Hilton Milton, people say is kind of a very big scale, right? Whatever the limitation, because I had experience of Hurricane Sandy in New York, and now for Florida, they're still, Florida, I think the Hurricane Helen is causing a lot of damage in the US. So I guess my question is, with all this great technology development, So there's no way to do something like, because you mentioned the dynamics, I guess because the global warming, whatever, make the atmosphere is warm, and then the ocean, the surface ocean temperature is also warm. So kind of scientists do something, to disturb that kind of dynamic a little bit. I mean, I haven't checked the ChatGPT, so I quickly check Bing. So there is saying, there are some scientists tried, I guess there's no really successful solution, but I would say there must be some kind of, right, so that's my question, right?
Yeah.
Just to disturb that, because I know certain country when they hold the Olympics, and they can artificially do something to change the weather pattern.
Yeah.
Right, okay, that's my question.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, when we think about solutions to these hazards, we mostly, and I think are going to be talking about adaptation, sort of how do we respond to these existing hazards and emerging hazards. Mitigation, which is
Right, exactly.
reducing the greenhouse gas emissions so that we don't get as many of these hazards. But then there's this other category called geoengineering, which
Right.
is getting more and more attention. Usually it's thought about in the context of, like, at a planetary scale, are there steps we could take to reduce the amount of warming? Small particles that might block, basically change the Earth's energy balance. We don't have time to get into all of that, but suffice it to say that the legal, ethical issues of that kind of geoengineering would be enormous. There'd be all sorts of issues related to the sort of Frankenstein scenarios, opening Pandora's box. Even if you were able to push temperatures back down, you wouldn't get the climate of old. You'd have a lot of, we don't have time to get into that, but your question is more specific, I think. It's about, are there things we could do to reduce the power or size of these hurricanes? And the short answer right now is really no. It is true that, at smaller scales, there have been some successes, if you will, at causing rain in certain situations when conditions are favorable, giving a little bit of a nudge so that more rain can fall in a dry area. And even to some extent, when there's not a huge storm going on, efforts to suppress rainfall, with just a typical sort of afternoon thunderstorm or something. Those efforts are not well established, but there have been, I'd say, maybe some minor successes. That really can't be compared, though, to the power of a storm like this. A storm like this, you have to think of as, I can't even remember what the order of magnitude is, but, this is more than 1,000 times, all the nuclear bombs probably, in terms of just the sheer energy. So you start thinking about it, but that really conveys just how profoundly we're changing the planet. To warm the upper oceans to the extent we have has taken an incredible amount of energy. It's not something that there's any easy way to sort of dial back. And once a storm is incredibly powerful, I can't really imagine a way to divert it, weaken it. Never say never. These technologies may emerge. But the only way I today could think of that working would be at the earliest stages, when it's a small wave sort of coming off of the coast of West Africa or something, for example. That's not where this storm originated, but that's where a lot of our hurricanes in the Atlantic grow. But which storms, right? Which ones would be the ones that are going to grow? That's the butterfly effect. You don't know. So never say never, but based on everything we know today, we are an infinitude away, I would say, from being able to knock down anything as powerful or divert anything as powerful as this catastrophic hurricane. It's just too powerful, and the shifts that we've made in the planet's energy balance are so huge as to be impossible, more close to impossible to quickly ameliorate. Longer term, we can reduce our emissions.
Okay, so then you're saying the root cause of this still the so-called global warming. So in order to, because we already experienced all these extreme weathers, right? So basically, for example, I lived in New York for more than 20 years, and then the past 10 years I lived in Asia and China. And in Beijing, for example, they experience extreme weathers, because the summer they can be even hotter than whatever Hong Kong. So, and then the winter is really, really cold, because it's having the similar latitude with New York, but in winter, Beijing's winter is even whatever many magnitude colder than here. So I'm not sure, maybe because there have more emission in China. So then if that's the case, so basically that really a strong case in the sense we really should to push this clean energy, right? So because if it's so much whatever emission, then the climate, I mean, whatever, the climate risk is really a present and danger, right? Present and whatever is the word,
Yeah,
or
just-
clear and present danger, because a lot of people say, oh, that's not a danger, but there is, because this Hurricane Milton is already scared a lot of people.
I want to get us over to Mike, just quickly to say, these hazards, these storms have always existed, and heat waves, climate change is making them far worse. The most obvious things to do are reduce our greenhouse gas emissions.
Right.
But we can't make the storms or the heat go away. We can adapt. We can make our streets more shaded so the intensity of the heat is less. We can try to capture some of the rainwater. We can build seawalls. There's no easy fix, though, in terms of just making the events themselves weaker. Go ahead, Chief.
When Donald Trump was in the White House, he raised the question, could you knock out a hurricane by detonating a nuclear weapon inside it? And the answer is no, you get yourself a radioactive hurricane. But as Radley said, ultimately the solution has to be drastically reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, which is mostly a matter of moving almost entirely, or entirely if we can, away from fossil fuels, and also changing agricultural and forestry and other practices. As Radley also said, geoengineering really falls into two categories: carbon dioxide removal, removing the CO2 that's in the atmosphere, and solar radiation management. The carbon dioxide removal, there's a lot of R&D going on, but so far it's extremely expensive and extremely slow. Maybe someday it'll develop that it'll really work. But even if we were to stop all greenhouse gas emissions now, we would still be at whatever we are, 1.3 degrees, 1.5 degrees. So it would still be very bad. In order to really get to the climate we want, we have to remove a lot of the CO2 and methane from the atmosphere. Solar geoengineering is very scary. It's blocking out some of the sunlight. Unfortunately, it is completely unregulated, and so somebody could try it, which leads to all kinds of other terrible consequences. One of the books I've edited is about these issues of geoengineering, but no one should look at it as a viable solution at this time, but I think somebody may try it if things get bad enough.
So if I understand you correctly,
Get
but
to some
apologize. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, this question is for Dr. Radley Horton as well. So I know that for disasters, there are early warning systems, and we saw that for Hurricane Helene, it changed from a Category 1 to a Category 4 storm overnight, which failed those early warning systems. So I'm just wondering, for any disaster, but especially hurricanes, or what sort of technology needs to advance in order to create mechanisms for adapting earlier? And yeah, I guess I was just a little shocked about how there's been so few advancements in that area, because I feel like that's key for adaptation going forward.
Yeah, another great question. So much to unpack there. I think I would start by saying, pre any event at all, right? I think one of the takeaways, for example, from Helene, but also this development on the west coast of Florida, is we haven't been appreciating these risks that we know are there, right? Even before climate change is making them worse, even before it's allowing storms to intensify and surprise, if you will, us faster. We have already known that we were building in vulnerable areas in so many mountainous, regions of Appalachia, for example. Most of your critical infrastructure, most of the homes are in a lot of these valleys, right? So that's, and if you look at the coast of Florida, you've had more and more development in a lot of these areas. the infrastructure hasn't kept up. You know, it becomes almost something of a Ponzi scheme, you know, where it's hard to imagine how you can sort of deleverage and get people out of harm's way, many of whom have been encouraged to move to these areas without fully understanding the risks. So there's all sorts of equity dimensions to that too. You have more and more sort of shoddy at best insurance providers who aren't really in a position to sort of stay whole when totally predictable events happen. So that's some of the background U.S. context. It'd be great to hear some more international examples. But then in terms of when a storm is actually approaching, there are some successes around the world. Bangladesh, you know, one country that's brought up, you know, many times in a positive way for increases in those sort of early warning systems, getting messages out, using forecasts. Wasn't uncommon to have 250,000 people die in some catastrophic cyclones of the 60s, 1970s. We'd like to think that couldn't happen today, although sea level rise is certainly introducing new risks. These warmer oceans don't just mean that the storms can go from category 1 to 3 faster, they also unfortunately mean that they can spin up near coastlines more easily than they did in the past. Basically, essentially going from nothing to maybe not a 5, but a hurricane with serious rain faster. Let's hear from others maybe about either context outside the U.S. or maybe about some of the other things that can be done in terms of preparation as an event's approaching.
Thank you. Next question.
I'll just, you also have political opposition to adaptation. Florida is about to be slammed, and its governor a couple of years ago said the government shouldn't even talk about climate change. And so if you refuse to recognize the reality and you refuse to adapt to it, that's really asking for great difficulties. Whenever the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, tries to redraw the flood maps to show that more areas are vulnerable, they're attacked politically, and they're constrained from doing that. So we have a lot of notions about how to prepare and how to adapt, but often politics stands in the way.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing about the insights on SIDS. I come from Singapore, which is also a small island, so a lot of the adaptation concerns have been quite similar as well. Okay, I have 2 questions. Firstly, on the loss and damage fund. From my understanding, we are still in the process of trying to establish what that fund would look like and how that transfer from developed countries and to countries who need that adaptation could happen. I remember during Climate Week, during the Environmental Economics Conference right here in Colombia, the keynote speaker, Professor Solomon Siang, actually did propose how that could look like. But by when should this LD fund be established for it to meaningfully help SIDS in their adaptation plans? Another question is, if that doesn't happen, then we need other kinds of finance. How can, let's say, impact investing also help to finance adaptation efforts in SIDS?
Well,
Do you want to take a few more questions and then respond?
Yeah, we first now.
Okay, all right. Yeah, sure. Thank you. Loss and damage fund has been established in Dubai COP in 2023. It requires bit of work procedurally to establish the mechanisms through which funding can be obtained and applied. But it's capitalization that is outstanding at the moment. Capitalization means actually those countries and organizations that have pledged funding that actually needs to disperse and transfer the funding, those finances to the fund. And for the fund to disperse them to the countries who have applied for the funding. That's where the scale becomes important. For climate adaptation, we are talking about, on average in the SIDS, climate adaptation projects would be roughly about $20 to $30 million. In the case of the Maldives, that figure is even higher. It would be about $100 to $150 million. So therefore, scale of pledges and scale of disbursements is question number one. Number two is the process that would take for a country to actually access the funding. Now, climate funding normally takes about 6 months to 16 months for a country to actually get access to the funding. Now, we would like to reduce that period to 3 months. That's the idea, that's the objective. So when we go to Baku in November, we want to achieve these two things: increase the scale and reduce the amount of time for a country to obtain funding from loss and damage fund. I hope I was able to answer your question.
I just wanted to add a note, since there's so many Columbia people here, that several weeks ago, the Loss and Damage Fund announced the new executive director, and he is a Columbia graduate. He was my student at SIPA. His name is Ibrahima Sheikh Diong from Senegal, and he will be taking office running the day-to-day operations of the Loss and Damage Fund in a few weeks.
Next question, yeah.
Thank you. My question is for Your Excellency, and thank you for attending, coming to Columbia. You had mentioned in your speech that access to adaptation finance is a key kind of pillar for recovery and survival here. If Maldives is able to get the type of finance that it needs, what categories of funding would you use that for? What type of infrastructure funding? Like, what are the most, if you were able to get that necessary finance, what would the country actually use it for?
Right. That question relates to our overall approach to development planning and economic development in the country. In the Maldives, almost any infrastructure project is now can be categorized as a climate adaptation project, whether it is construction of a school, from construction of a road to building code itself has undergone tremendous changes because the newly constructed buildings have to withstand potential disaster from climate change. What we are doing right now is actually, I told you in my presentation that people in the Maldives live in 187 islands. Now, it would become impossible for any government to protect these 187 islands in the event of sea level rise or any other climate-induced disaster. So we are trying to bring population to less number of islands and physically protect these islands by constructing seawalls and elevating the islands themselves. Now, we are also, perhaps international lawyers might question some of our techniques. We are also constructing artificial islands, not in the middle of the sea, but in the lagoons. Artificial islands, we already have done one. We constructed one island from 1997 to 2002, and that island is next to the capital, which is now connected by a bridge. That island is 6 feet above sea level. Our average is 3 feet above sea level. This island is 6 feet above sea level. And we are going to construct one more island that will be even higher. So higher elevation, construction of seawalls around it. Now the seawalls that we have constructed in the country are 15 feet on average. The new seawalls will be about 20 feet. And then have physical infrastructure, civil infrastructure that will withstand the impact of climate change and sea level rise especially.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, so for SIDS, the climate adaptation seems like the hard solutions are like seawalls, the approach nowadays. And is there a room for soft solution like nature-based solution? And considering that will also improve the biodiversity, reducing carbon footprint, and also potentially be a more long-sighted approach. I believe the limitation is also the availability on the land space and the immediate effect on those natural-based solutions, but I feel like that might be taken as consideration for SIDS.
Can I? In the case of the Maldives, nature-based solution, we are experimenting with a project actually is being implemented. Actually, during the UN General Assembly, we hosted a side event at the UN to showcase the progress we have made in climate adaptation using. We are working with MIT self-assembly lab and a Maldivian startup, techno startup. They are collaborating. Is entirely private sector driven to number one, protect the coastal erosions, and number two, actually reclaim land using ocean current as a mechanism. The scientists would be able to shed some light on that without using dredges, without using the traditional ways of constructing seawalls. This is a way in which they do some mechanics within the lagoon to redirect the distribution of sand that helps to protect the shore. We are currently working in the resorts. This project, startup project, has actually worked with an up and coming developing island resort by Hilton and another big brand in the Maldives. I was told that 30% of that island was actually reclaimed by this nature-based solution. It's a promising technology which is still being tested. We are hoping that in the coming 3 to 5 years' time, they would be able to have a more concrete solutions on that.
Thank you.
You want to jump in?
Yeah, to echo really the last point about the importance of testing all these strategies, thinking about all their benefits and costs. I think, this type of seawall is a pretty clear case of where it's going to be needed. It's essential. I think in other parts of the world, there are going to be real questions about the situations where seawalls might increase vulnerability. There's going to be more and more discussions about emissions associated with seawalls and concrete. But I don't think those necessarily are front and center here when we're thinking about these really existential threats, especially in places where there might be reason to think tropical cyclones aren't as big of a risk as say sea level rise. Those are going to be the cases where maybe seawalls seem a little more promising. I think nature-based solutions undeniably are going to make sense in terms of conferring a lot of ecological benefits and sort of livelihood benefits. They just need to be tested like all these strategies. We certainly don't want to be a situation where we're sort of assuming that, say, an artificial mangrove or restoring a new mangrove will be able to sort of fully or even partially attenuate, say, tropical cyclone surges, although there's plenty of reason to think that nature-based solutions can be very beneficial, very low cost, and very helpful. I guess given the scale of the hazards, we're going to need a range of approaches. And there are going to be some places around the world where there are just going to be discussions about retreat. There already are, but that's not going to be the right solution everywhere.
Thank you. More questions?
Hi, thank you so much for being here. So I just graduated from the climate school, actually, where we talked a lot about, the science, the threats, the hazards, and some possible solutions for sea level rise and SIDS. But my question is where these theories more meet reality, because at the end of the day, we know that these decisions are hardly ever being made just on climate science. So for these negotiations to formally decide on, what can happen to SIDS, citizenship, and all these big questions, how do you see these negotiations moving forward? What are the biggest barriers, especially considering the geopolitical factors and the Security Council and who sits on that Security Council? And so, what do you think are the biggest barriers, and what are the things that are really being talked about, I guess, behind closed doors, if you can say? And are there, any ways to get around it? Because even the statement from the president, I mean, it's great, but as far as I know, it's not really binding. So how do we make sure that when it comes to it, we have a former solution? Thank you.
In the negotiations are intergovernmental negotiations. 193 countries need to agree on. and therefore, by definition, 193 different views. So bring in all those views into one clearly defined objective is hard. It's going on, climate negotiations going on for more than 35 years now. Since 1995, we started the actual negotiations, but before that, in the preparation for the Rio Summit in 1992. So it's a long process. What we eventually agree on as diplomats are the lowest common denominator that countries can agree on, both emitting and non-emitting countries. Therefore, there's a lot of room for SIDS, for example, to work bilaterally with group of countries or with specific countries in order to support, to receive support, technological and financial, in building their ability to adapt. Now, mitigation, yes, mitigation is important for every country, whether you are emitting or not emitting, because there is an economic cost associated with that. For the Maldives, for example, reducing our CO2 emissions or reducing oil import has enormous economic benefit, regardless of its climate dimension. But adaptation is where actual focus need to be, and adaptation is where securing an agreement is most difficult. And persuading countries that you have to clean up the mess that you created has been difficult, although it's not with any kid. You can say that since you created this mess, you need to clean it. But with governments, the logic is different. They don't agree that they created that mess. But loss and damage has come a long way. And if we are to use the principle of loss and damage, then we tend to be hopeful that the key principles of climate justice will eventually be accepted universally, if not universally, at least by key emitters, historical as well as current emitters. And therefore, the emitting countries need to help countries who have been and might in the future be the victims of climate change.
Just add, the negotiators, of course, all report to their home governments. They're not autonomous. And so what happens in each of those countries and the politics of those countries makes all the difference. The outcome of the U.S. election next month will determine whether the U.S. is participating in these negotiations or not at all. And so you obviously have fluctuations in lots of different countries. If we had more stability in governments and more assurance about continuity, that would be a much better situation than we have now, when some governments flip back and forth, making it hard to achieve the kinds of agreements that are necessary.
Hi, my question is for Professor Gerard. It's been a while since the climate change law class, and great to see you again. So talking about SIDS nation, we talk a lot about climate-induced mobility, like migration. And up to date, there's still no specific sort of international legal framework to for climate-related migration. So do you foresee, for example, we talk about the case of Kiribati, and do you foresee the development of such international legal system to kind of provide a safe migration pathway for the SIDS population before the large-scale climate-induced migration become a reality? Thank you.
So you're quite right that there is no binding international agreement on climate mobility. There are some specific agreements that are worked out. So the United States accepts people from the Marshall Islands and Micronesia and Palau under a special arrangement. Australia recently agreed to accept a certain number of people from some of the small island nations. But as we're seeing right now, the issue of migration and immigration is fiercely fought politically, and I am not aware of any of the major countries that are today willing to accept large numbers of people who are displaced by climate change. One can hope that that will happen in the future, but right now we don't have that. There are a number of United Nations resolutions that call for widespread acceptance and so forth, but they're non-binding, and it's difficult to envision agreement to binding commitments to accept large numbers of climate displaced people.
Thank you. Last question.
My question is for His Excellency on the Loss and Damage Fund. If the priority was to operationalize this fund quickly and ensure that disbursements happen quickly as well within a 3-month time frame, why was the push for a loss and damage fund, have it as a separate financing entity compared to having a carve out within one of the existing international financing facilities, so that way you already have an established framework to operate out of? So why push for a loss and damage fund externally instead of including it in one of the existing funds? And just to give some context, I'm not anti-loss and damage fund. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, a SID as well. So it's just a different perspective, I guess, that I've started thinking about.
Right. SIDS included in the Maldives have been very, very critical of the international financial architecture, the current international financial architecture, starting from the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, to the smaller funds, Global Environment Facility included. The governance mechanisms of these funding agencies, whether they are at a regional level or global level, are not really conducive to the requirements and needs of SIDS. They operate almost like any other bank that you go to in Wall Street, even worse than some of the commercial banks, because it takes even a longer time to realize the results of your application. So, and secondly, loss and damage itself, as the name suggests, has a very, very specific and unique purpose, and that purpose is not necessarily always, I would say, in alignment with the existing funding mechanisms. So therefore, there has always been a clear need for independent and separate financing mechanism. And I can tell you that even during the negotiations that went on for nearly 12 to 15 years, that was not a point of contention. There was always an agreement, both from funding countries as well as recipient countries, that the mechanism has to be separate from the existing mechanisms because of the speed at which funding is required. The purpose was different, and the normative value that has been associated with loss and damage has been quite unique compared to the other funding mechanisms.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you all for online watching. This is a wonderful evening. The conversation will go on after this. Thank you.